But that's what happened to the government at all levels, and that's what happened to the banking institutions. Too busy counting the bloody money to stay focused on regulation. So you've got these foreign investors. So you've got two issues. You got foreign investors and foreign developers / builders that came into the country that because of private certification, it allowed them to basically pay people off to certify the foundation work of a 60, 30, 40, 50, 60 level apartment complex. And in some cases, and I've got it documented, where builders were removing the reinforcement or the steel, at least 40-50% of the steel from the foundation works after the inspection was done, before the concrete was poured. They were removing 50% of it to utilize that in the next slab.
If I own gold or silver, how will I ever be able to spend it?
Oh, sure. Well, consider good times or bad times. Like in good times, you can sell it back to the same place you bought it from. sdbullion.com/RP will buy it back at the best price guaranteed on the internet. You can take it to a local coin shop and get cash in your hand, completely anonymous. Some people you know may be willing to take gold or silver coins in exchange for goods or services. Now, in bad times, when things have really fallen apart, time after time in history, people have found that in hard times, gold and silver really does come through as something that people recognize as value even after everything else has failed.
Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP. Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a first-time guest joining us tonight. This is Edwin Almeida. He's a real estate expert from Ribbon Property Consultant. Edwin, thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Well, thank you for having me on your show, and I hope your audience can get some great information.
We're going to have you on because we got concerned watching a video where you appeared as a special guest with John Adams about a crisis and basically an unaddressed crisis happening in Australia with high-rise construction that is exhibiting all kinds of unsafe issues and health risks and that sort of thing for the residents. But it seemed to be sort of like the tip of an iceberg of a much more broad-based problem. And it occurred to me that we might need to talk about this as Austrian economist Mises calls the Crackup boom that happens at the end of a large capitalist expansion, when you have runaway misallocation of capital, easy money policies, people just piling on, and all of the usual checks and balances and due diligence and proper procedures and standards that are normally followed get thrown out the window in the mania of a boomtown rush. And just wondering, we definitely have seen that happen time and time again on the financial side of things, and we know what happens is a huge misallocation of capital in those times into areas that are non-productive. But in some ways, it sounds like it's not just financial risks that are piling up, but physical and health risks here that people need to be aware of, because they need to be also aware that government and other regulators are not watching out for the best public interest, and that they need to take steps on their own to do their own research if they want to keep themselves and their families safe, in addition to keeping their finances safe. So could you start from the beginning by telling us how in the world someone gets into, as you did, kind of being a whistleblower or a vigilante in face of this evidently widespread unaddressed corruption and public health risk?
In the interest of the consumer, I've always been looking out for the interest of the consumer. I'm a realtor, being one for over 20 years. I've been in the building industry and involved with property for a lot longer than that. So I guess when I took up the role as being a realtor and looking into obviously assisting families move into a principal place of residence, and we started doing a shift from residential freestanding homes to medium density development, and then moved into the high-rise development that we're in now. Obviously, it's a huge investment that individual families make. So I took that seriously. As I've said with many of my clients, that for me it's about long-term relationships that build character and build a great business, a business model. So when in say 1989, 88, 89, between New South Wales, the state of New South Wales and the state of Queensland, they deregulated the construction industry, and it became self-regulated to an extent. That is when the government dropped the ball. That is when the state governments basically allowed for private certification of construction to take place, and in doing so, it opened up a whole can of worms. Because effectively you could get your mate, you could get your friend that was a private certifier. So you got your mate from which was, let's say, from the building industry that you went to university together with, you basically knew, and it became a free for all. The standards were somewhat diluted. Moving on from that, in the early 2000s, what we ended up with was pre 2000, leading up to the Sydney Olympic, the famous Sydney Olympic Games, we ended up with a bit of a boom. But the boom that we had back then wasn't as big as what it is now. And the reason it being is because we weren't building as much higher rise. It was medium density. It was generally about 5-6 levels of apartment blocks around central hubs that were building up, but there was still a bit of an oversupply. Things still got a little bit out of hand. The controls weren't there to monitor that. So that is when the first time that the banks, the banking institutions, and the financial sector realised, hold on a minute, there's a bit of money that can be made here if basically we speculate, and that was the beginning of the Ponzi schemes that we know now. In the early 2000s, I actually sat with many accountants from which are medium tier firms here in Sydney now, with accountants that I went to school with, and they were putting together ideas and ways to get overseas investors to come into the market and to buy property. With obviously we had very strict foreign investment ownership regulations. Now, post 2000, those regulations, to give you an idea, if I was to build an apartment block that consisted of 27, say 30 units or 30 apartments or condos, as you would call them, I would only be able to sell 6 or 7 of those to foreign investors in that particular block of apartments. So what happened was that the general public weren't absorbing that the balance as readily as what the developers and the financial institutions would like them to do so. And quite frankly, there was still a fair bit of industry, and there was a fair bit of when I say industry, it was still sprawled out in the suburbs, in the further west from the CBD. The CBD, Sydney CBD, as most of your viewers would know, is closer to the eastern suburbs, to the harbour there, where you famously see our harbour bridge and our opera house.
That's the central business district, is it?
That's a central business district. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's now in the early 2000s. We still had a little bit of action out in the west, northwest, west, and southwest regions. When I say a bit of action, we still had small manufacturing, small warehousing. There was a bit of activity. But what happened was a lot of that then obviously went overseas, went to Asia. A lot of Asian countries. We got rid of our manufacturing. We basically become totally reliant on imports. So what happened in order to keep the economy going was the Foreign Investment Review Board laxed the rules and regulations as to who can own, or basically that foreign investors could own whole apartment blocks, not just seven apartments in a block of or 7 condos in a block of 30, but they could literally buy them all out. So they laxed the law. So that opened up a whole can of worms. At that time, China was obviously a lot of the people in the know understood that there were a lot of changes happening there as well, and they wanted to get the black money out of China through the shadow banking system, and we copped, like Canada, we copped a lot of that foreign investment money, that black money that came over from China, and a lot of Chinese people. To give you an idea, some of my colleagues were actually, when we had open homes or open for inspections, or when we were showing the newly built condos and then displayed, people were turning up with cases full of money. I'm talking about $200,000, $300,000 to put a deposit down in cash for apartments, and that's how much of the black money was coming over into Sydney. So that was happening with the new. Obviously, the government was saying, "Oh, yes, we've allowed this to happen because it's bolstering the economy. We're assisting the local economy, yada yada yada."
Not hurting them at all either, with the tax base inflating and so on. Yeah.
So then, and what they were saying was that, but we're not allowing them to buy established property, right? So that was in the black letter of the law. However, our banking system, our financial system is full of holes like cheddar cheese, and what was happening, as I said, as I alluded earlier, in these meetings that I was a party to in the early 2000s, there were accountancy firms working out ways to allow foreign investors to buy established homes, and they were doing so. And it's quite simple. Effectively, you set up a company, you set up a trust underneath the company, and the trust buys the property. Now, obviously, the issue that a lot of people have, that we would have in setting up a company and then setting up a trust underneath the company to buy a property, which some people do if you've got, if that's how you want to protect your assets, that's what you do. But what happens is, obviously, the banking institutions don't take it very kindly if your deposits are by a small deposits, and they're going to loan you a lot of, the LVR, the loan to value ratio is very high. However, when you've got foreign investors doing this with 40, 50, 60% deposits in cash, of course the bank's going to lend them the other 40, 50, 60% because it's a no-brainer. They're not taking any risk whatsoever. So the established homes were being bought and still owned by companies, because although you as an individual can't own an established home, you can't buy an established home here as a foreign investor, but the company that you set up here, which you're allowed to set up 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 20 companies, can, as long as if the banks are going to loan you the money. So this is how you gain traction. So then, obviously, the next leap to this was local area government corruption, which is the local governments. I think you guys call them the counties. So we've got Parramatta Council, we've got Blacktown Council, the LGA's local government area sections. There's 56 local area governments in New South Wales, and a lot of them are in Sydney. So Sydney's split up into smaller regions. So we've got 3 tiers of government. Now, a lot of these developers and a lot of the builders took on positions in the local government area council in the board. So they became the lawmakers, you could say, of the local area. They deemed and determined what could be built in that local, in the LGA. So they changed the regulations. To give you another example, from being allowed to build, you go on feet, so being allowed to build 30 apartments on 3,000 square feet of land, right? All of a sudden, we were now allowed to build 110 apartments or condos on the same block of land. So the buildings became taller, and in order to accommodate for parking, we had to dig deeper into the ground in order to facilitate for parking for the residents. The problem with that is that we're not really used to building anything above 5-6 levels. The majority of the builders won't. Secondly, most of Sydney is built either on clay or on water tables. Most of Sydney is a floodplain. You've got Parramatta River, you've got all the tributaries that flow into the ocean, and so we're basically on a floodplain. So the stories that you've been hearing about the Opal Tower, Mascot Tower, in regions of Parramatta, these are all on water tables, right? So obviously, the deeper you dig, the deeper you dig, the more problems you're going to get. And we're not used to that type of construction. Secondly, when the floodgates opened up and all these loopholes opened up for foreign investors to basically park their black money into Australia, predominantly Sydney and Melbourne, it just opened up the floodgates. So then next thing you know, you got plane loads of foreign investors, predominantly Chinese. We had bus tours. We had, at times, in some of the apartment, in some of the display units that we had, we would have 3, 4, even 5 buses. Your Greyhound buses turn up full of foreign investors. Now, some of these people weren't just buying one; some were buying 2, 3, 4 condos in the same block of units that were proposed to be built in this area. Some of the headlines that your viewers, that your followers would, if they go back to if they Google, some of the headlines read, 260 apartments sold in one weekend. So when all this started happening, I started taking closer attention to, as I said, to the different levels, the different tiers of corruption. Local government area corruption with the local councillors, allowing developers to triple the amount of property that could build on a block of land, and changing the LEPs, changing the local environment planning sectors for certain areas, because it just went nuts. It went crazy. Then you've got state government corruption as well, because where certain local governments said, put the foot down and said, no, we don't want to overbuild these particular areas, then the state government moved in and said, no, we need these corridors to be open because progress and blah blah blah, and the economy, and we need to expand transport, and we need to create these hubs further out west to accommodate for the growth and expansion, which was all BS. It was really, once again, corruption in the state government level. And at the federal, at the highest level of government, I was been saying for 8 years, for 8-9 years now, how is it that knowing that a Chinese national can only take out $50,000 out of China in their lifetime, how is it that the federal government, our own government, are allowing the Chinese people to come in with $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 and dropping deposits of $300,000, $400,000 in one transaction, and they turn a blind eye to it? It's because at a local government, the fees from developing a new property went from $5,000 per new property built. So if you have a house and you divide that house into, and you build a duplex or you build 2 dwellings on it, right, you pay a council contribution, which is, say, $5,000 for each new dwelling. So you went from 2 old homes on 500-600 square meters of land to 110 dwellings. Do the math. So that's how the local government also benefited from the development. Not only that, then they increased those fees from 5,000 in some areas to 16,000. So of course it was in their best interest. So that was their way out. Oh, but look, we're allowing progress. We're allowing this to happen, and look at how much money is coming into the council by way of contributions, and therefore everything's sweet. Well, guess what? It's not sweet, because not only did we get an influx of black money, not only did we get our own banking system went crazy, went nuts with this whole Ponzi scheme, and they started dishing out money. Like it was just being printed on any bit of paper that they could grab, and just dishing it out like it was cotton candy on a Sunday at a Sunday fair. They just started dishing it out, and obviously, in order to keep this Ponzi scheme moving along, now the locals couldn't keep up with it, but the banks didn't really care, because they were fixated on the foreign money that was coming in, because there was a lot more foreign money. There was a lot more foreigners buying property. At the moment, to give you an idea, there are approximately 10 million dwellings, right? 10 million built dwellings in Australia. That's an approximate. There are 1.3 million dwellings that are vacant, and most of them are owned by foreign investors. So that's a hell of a lot of property in comparison to what is actually built and owned by locals and owned by foreign investors that are vacant. There's a lot more that are owned by foreign investors that are also rented out, leased out. But these are vacant properties, and there's another 300,000 in the pipeline being built currently. So you've got all these issues that have just on top of each other, and obviously then one of the things that wasn't being regulated was going back to the deregulation of in 1989 was the construction.
Right. And I wanted to ask you if we could return to that, because so far you've laid out a very grim scenario of multi-layers of corruption and bringing in inappropriate investment of foreign money, which you mentioned in passing the effect that this had on the local people, because you can only imagine local people who are trying to earn a living and buy a place to live for their family are now trying to compete against this flood of illegal foreign money coming in, and how can an ordinary family compete against that with these prices running away? How is a person supposed to get a place to live? But beyond the financial impacts of it, you were talking about standards being set aside as well from the construction.
So what
standards.
happened with that's when our governments, our regulators across those levels, they dropped the ball altogether. Now, not only did foreign money come in, but obviously foreign builders and developers came in as well, because look, you jump on board, and like I said, you can own a company here. You can be a foreigner. You can own 10 companies if you wanted to, and you could come in and out. You don't necessarily have to be a resident of Australia to own a company or to work here. Like there are a lot of loopholes. Now, so what happened was, obviously all this money's coming in, piling in from overseas. The banks are loosening their grip on things in order to accommodate for the local people as well. So money's just flowing left, right, and centre with no real asset base, because their asset base became the dwelling. Unbeknownst to the banking institution, unbeknownst to the governments, that these dwellings are cankered. These dwellings are riddled with problems. So effectively, their asset base is really just going to crumble away. Buildings are meant to be built for 40, 50 to withstand 40, 50 years at a minimum, but yet we're building them to really only last anywhere between 5 and 10 years before major defects start showing, and all because there were no regulations at play. So this is where the economist talks about allowing all this money to just flow out, no controls. Obviously, there are broader implications to having money come in from, it's like almost liken it to the old Disney cartoons, where you've got Daffy Duck, counting the money. In the meantime, he's going to get hit by a train or something, because he's too people become too conscious of counting the money, not knowing all the dangers around them that are or I can't remember what the cartoon was, but there's where a coin rolls onto a main junction, and this particular character is following the coin. And in the meantime, there's all these trucks, buses, taxis, cars, bikes. Because he's fixated on the coin. I think it was Daffy Duck's uncle, one of those. Just an old cartoon. But that's what happened.
Oh, Scrooge McDuck, the rich uncle.
It.
Yeah,
I think it was one of those. But that's what happened to the government at all levels, and that's what happened to the banking institutions. Too busy counting the bloody money to stay focused on regulation. So you've got these foreign investors. So you've got two issues. You got foreign investors and foreign developers / builders that came into the country that because of private certification, it allowed them to basically pay people off to certify the foundation work of a 60, 30, 40, 50, 60 level apartment complex. And in some cases, and I've got it documented, where builders were removing the reinforcement or the steel, at least 40, 50% of the steel from the foundation works after the inspection was done, before the concrete was poured. They were removing 50% of it to utilize that in the next slab. And obviously what makes it's all about the foundation. What you see in the building, it's all great, it's all all the glossy stuff, that's all good, but the essence is really the foundation. What we don't see that makes or breaks the building. So all these things are happening in the foundation, and keep in mind that we're building, we're adding, we're loading so much weight by way of construction and by way of population on top of water tables. So sooner than later, Mother Nature is going to kick back. Mother Nature's just going to say, I've had enough here. So that's what's happening from the banking, foreign investment, the delusion in the banking institutions, the delusion of the foreign investment controls, and also the dissolving the governance over the over construction standards. So in the meantime, we're building all these high-rise now developments, all these high-rise apartments that are riddled with problems. What you hear about is not. I don't even consider them to be. That's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's a lot more inherent issues with this construction that hasn't been reported yet. And that,
before you go on there, I just wanted to recap for our viewers that what you're referring to, Edwin, is this glaring structural flaws, as what's been reported, these big cracks and pillars that are crumbling, and this very structural integrity of the foundations themselves of these large high-rise buildings, up to estimated more than 1,000 buildings similarly affected by this, that could potentially collapse or could be.
Yeah, there's in terms of foundation issues, in terms of construction structural issues, you could probably across Australia there'd be close on to perhaps even more than 1,000. But you in terms of other issues which are just as bad, which is the cladding that you've heard about, that buildings, the flammable cladding that are being adopted by the fact that we stopped manufacturing. So as I said earlier on in our discussion, I said the outer regions of Sydney, where we had some form of structure, we had some form of manufacturing, we had some form of industry, all that collapsed, and we started relying more on foreign imports. So that also diluted the standard and the quality of materials that we use. And now it's been reported that there's over 5,000 buildings across Australia with flammable cladding. So it just takes a spark to set those babies off. So you've got so you've got those issues. On top of that, what happened was, because the buildings got obviously more dense, higher, a lot more population in them. So they packed a lot more condos into each level. So we became more reliant on mechanical ventilation. And although the mechanical ventilation meets the building standard, but the building standards were set in the early 60s, and they haven't really been reviewed. So they were set for that particular style of construction. The good standards, the high standards, but haven't been reviewed for high-rise construction, if you know what I mean. So you've got the mechanical ventilation meets the standard, but doesn't meet the lifestyle. You've got our lifestyles have changed. We don't leave doors and windows open to ventilate your dwellings anymore. You leave your doors and windows open, and you come back and you've got no furniture. We were managing an apartment in a block in a small tower in Parramatta, and the thief climbed 11 stories, scaled 11 stories to get into the next door neighbor's apartment. Obviously, the next door neighbor was a jeweler, and he had some jewelry there, blah blah. But that's the extent of it. So you've got all these things happening. So obviously, there's a lot of changes, lifestyle changes. We went from having 1 in 10 families living in an apartment to now it's approximately 1 in 4 families will live in an apartment or a complex. Mm-hmm. So our lifestyles have changed, but the standards, the building standards, haven't changed. Like I said, they're good standards if you follow them to the letter of the law. If you have supervision, but they don't. Supervision's diluted. and also lifestyles have changed, so they've got to change as well. They haven't kept up with the times. So you've got issues now with mold in a lot of these complexes, medium density, high density, high rise. You've got mold issues. You've got bad ventilation. You've got mechanical ventilation failing in the basement car parks because we're on floodplains. We're on water tables, so therefore they've got to have pumps pumping out the water from the basement. Before we would dig, say we would dig 12, 14. I'm just trying to do the calculations to your one. We would dig 15 feet in order to create basement parking at the most. Now we're digging 90 feet in order to accommodate for parking. So obviously you've got to adopt more mechanical ventilation, which produces toxins in terms of fumes, and therefore you've got to have them running 24/7, because if you're the poor bastard that parks in on level 4, basement 4, well, you got a long way to go before you can start breathing some fresh air. So you've got to have all this mechanical ventilation. So there's all these endemic problems with construction that were put to the side to allow this flow of money to come in. Now we're in a lot of trouble. And we're in a lot of trouble because, as I said, we started importing everything from overseas. We're not manufacturing anything here in Australia where we could control the standards. We've got asbestos in gyprock. We've got mold issues. We've got very poor quality electrical wiring. It's not supporting the high voltage that's required to maintain the high-rise developments. So we've got all these issues with these imported materials. We've got toxins in the timbers that are being imported for the flooring, for the cabinetry work, all these retardants that are in there that they're only just finding out now, that stuff that we in Australia have basically turned away from 30, 40 years ago. But in Asian countries where we're importing this stuff from, to have 10% or a small amount, it's okay. For them, that's a good standard, but not for us. And not the fact that we're going to be living in these condos, in these apartments for 20, 30, 40 years, if they last that long, that is. So you've got all these inherent issues now because of the low standards. And this is the big kicker, right? In all this, I believe it's all being orchestrated anyway, because all the suburbs, all these 25, 30 years ago, we got a decentralization of Sydney. Industry started moving out from the CBD, the Sydney CBD, and started moving out to allow for infrastructure to take place in the outer suburbs of Sydney, in order to decentralize, to basically spread the load out. 15 years ago, all the major corporations started going back into and making plans to go back into the CBD, into to work in the Sydney CBD. So I started taking note of the changes, and questioning why is it so. And then if you look at one of the videos that I did with Martin North, titled "All Roads Lead to Sydney," it's all about the infrastructure that has been built in Sydney over the last 20 years. They all point to the CBD. It's not about decentralizing and allowing for people to commute away from the CBD or within a 10-kilometre radius of the Sydney centre, and to push work and push say even banking. Parramatta is 25 kilometres or so from the the CBD. Parramatta is geographically the centre of Sydney, the original city. So from Parramatta, to give you an idea, they say that there in Parramatta, we've got one of the banking institutions, one of the 4 banks, CBA, has they occupy 2 buildings, and across those 2 buildings there are 7,000 employees, 7,000 people going to Parramatta to work. And Homebush, next door to Parramatta, there's another 2,000 employees. So 5 years ago, Parramatta CBA announced that they were moving back into Redfern. Now Redfern is at the CBD. It's just on the outskirts of the city centre. Redfern is 2 kilometres from the city centre of Sydney, right? So in Redfern, they have a purpose-built facility for this banking institution. So they're going to take 7,000 to 8,000 jobs in the next year or so, going back into the city. And most of the people that work in these across these 3 buildings, Homebush and Parramatta, most of the people live further out, live 35, 40, 50, 60 kilometres out, and they commute into Parramatta. Now they're going to be commuting all the way into the city in order to work. So this is what I say, all roads lead to the city centre. All the infrastructure, I believe, has been purposely built, because in hindsight, when you look at the type of infrastructure that the governments have built over the years, they haven't really allowed anything, or there's nothing substantive that you could say, well, we've taken this industry out into the west to accommodate the western suburbs, or the northwestern suburbs, or the southwestern suburbs. Just about everybody commutes into the city to work. That's one of the anomalies of this. Secondly, in early 80s, early 1980s, there was a proposal to have the second city of New South Wales, main city of New South Wales, to go over the mountains. Your viewers would know the Blue Mountains. There are medium towns over the mountains. One particular is called Orange, and there was a proposal by a politician to actually convert Orange, Bathurst and Orange, into the second city, to decentralise Sydney, to expand it. It would have been great for all the townships over the Blue Mountains, and would have been fantastic. But again, that got hit on the head, because the whole aim, even back from the early 80s, wasn't really to decentralise Sydney, was really to the whole purpose. I think we're moving into it's all orchestrated, that everything's really going to be concentrated in Sydney. They're protecting the CBD, they're protecting what happens within a 10-kilometre radius of the centre of Sydney, and everything else can go to hell. People say, oh yeah, but there's a lot being built in the outer suburbs, and when I get people making those comments, I say, okay, what's a lot? Oh yeah, but we've got shopping centres, and we've got really shopping centres. How many coffee shops do you need to sustain the economy? You know what I mean? Like even the law courts. 15 years ago, they tried to move part of the legal infrastructure, the law courts, into Parramatta to, again, decentralise and to spread the load, spread the work. Again, that they spent $30 million in refurbishing buildings in Parramatta to accommodate for the different courts, but the judges that live in the eastern suburbs and live in the city, they said, why the hell do we want to go out into the suburbs? And guess what? Most of these courts sit vacant, and yet the courts in the city, you've got to wait in the family law court, you've got to wait upwards of 12 months in order to get hearings. And yet we've got huge facilities that could accommodate a lot of these hearings in Parramatta. But yet the judges simply say, get somebody else. I'm not going there, because they're too comfortable to be close to the city.
in addition to these contradictions of decentralization versus about face and re-centralize again after the infrastructure gets built up to make that convenient and have other people have paid for it. You also talked in your earlier videos with Martin North and John Adams about some of the land itself. You've talked about the corruption and the money. You've talked about the shoddy building materials that were brought in and some of the construction practices. What about the safety or the health aspects of the sites themselves and the land itself? Is it safe for use? Are these places, you mentioned that they're on floodplains or above water tables or whatever, were some of these sites in need of remediation and didn't get it?
Look, you've got a lot of the areas pre 2000 when the hype of the Sydney Olympic Games came about. That whole area, that whole precinct, that Homebush precinct, was predominantly our industrial area back in the day. I remember when I was a kid, we used to ride push bikes around there. I lived not too far from there. I grew up not too far from Homebush, and we used to go around there and we used to ride push bikes. Where the Olympic Village was, or where the Homebush and Opal Tower sits at the moment, they were abattoirs. They accommodated the abattoirs. They accommodated some of the brickworks. They accommodated most of the industries that manufactured toxins, and we can even go further into the 40s, 50s, and I can tell you that some of the industries that were there that occupied that land and the surrounding areas, we manufactured napalm on that land to for the Vietnamese War and all that. That's where a lot of that took place. Now, obviously, back then things didn't get carted out. The pollutants weren't cut out. They were just pushed into Parramatta River. They were just buried in the sites. So in 1996, when our state government commissioned a professor to do a report on the suitability of Homebush and the Homebush Bay District to accommodate the Olympic Village and the Games, in this particular report, it was deemed that it was okay for the Games, for recreational, for some of the recreational, for future use as recreational facilities. And in terms of livability, it was okay. It wasn't the best, but it was okay to accommodate the Olympians for that small period of time. Beyond that, it would only be used as a recreational facility. Now, some of my mates that were very much into sport at that time, they were still playing in. One of them is now an accountant. He tells me that when they first built one of the first hockey courts in there, he got an opportunity to play with. He was playing at a very high level. He wasn't an Olympian, but he was playing at a very high level, very high state level. So they had some tournaments, trying out the facility. So they were all static. They were all excited. They were going to be able to be one of the first teams to play in the Olympic Village in the hockey stadium. He says, but halfway through the second half of his team members passed out, and likewise from the other side. And I said, what the hell? What was it too hot? What the hell was going on? I said, the fumes that were coming up from the turf, the fumes that were coming up were just so overwhelming that players had to be taken to hospital. But see, I know this stuff because I've got colleagues that were there. A lot of this obviously was kept hush hush. Then they had to returf, or what they actually did was they basically redug things out, and there are a lot of slab work that were put in before new turf got put on top of that, and so forth. So that gives you the extent of the toxins that are on that land. That's the Homebush Bay. So then when you start digging 90 feet into the ground, of course you're going to find a hell of a lot more. There are some contracts, there are some property contracts in not as many buildings now, but when you get the contract, the contract for the actual dwelling, you could say is yay thick, but the contamination contract attached to that contract of sale is yay thick. So
you're talking about documentation on some of these properties. Is that the actual construction and land contract is a thick document, but there's actually a thicker document about the contamination problem of the land?
That's right. Now, but mysteriously, the majority of those documents disappeared. So at that time, we were looking, my colleagues and myself, we were looking, obviously we're looking for land for developers. And when we approached some of these landholders in the Homebush Bay area within that region, when we looked at the contamination report, we said there's no way that our clients are gonna buy it. It was going to cost them more to remediate the land than it was going to cost to build in some cases. That was on the first round. On the second round, when these things, like in other words, 3, 4, 5 years later, when we came across the same blocks of land that were still available for sale, and we said, look, let's rehash this. Let's relook at this block of land in order to see whether, because prices obviously moved upwards, and when you did a reverse feasibility, the remediation, the gross realization and remediation, it all worked out at the end. But when we asked for the contract of sale, the contamination report was missing. And when we go back to the landowner and say, hold on a minute, I know of this block of land, and the original contract had a document yay thick with a contamination report. Where is it? And the landowner would look at the lawyers or the solicitors for the land that would look at square in the eye and say, what report? What are you talking about? So that's the sort of stuff that, in my time in that area, I actually know of one building that was completed, and the local government actually stepped in and got them to tear it down because of that. Now it was kept very quiet. It went up. Got completed, then it got brought down again, but it wasn't as high as what they are now. This would have been, I think it was only about 11 or 12 levels. So this is the roads area. So all these issues happen because of the Ponzi schemes, because of the black money coming in from China, and because of all the regulations and the regulatory bodies just allowing all this to happen, because it was really, in a way, it was free money.
Now, what happened to the certification process? You mentioned in the interview with Martin North and John Adams that there are building standards, especially about the structure itself, that sort of thing, but that not always did actual physical inspections actually occur. It was all done just on paper?
That's correct. So you're a private certifier. You certify certain work. So really, it's an individual that sits at home or sits in their office and goes through a pile of paper and is relying on all the tradespeople to say that the work got done according to the building specifications, according to the building standards. How do you know? Well, must be an honest person. The tradesperson, they did the work. I can the developer says, yeah, I can vouch for that. Yeah, I was there. Okay, so it must be true. If you tell me so, it must be true. So they sign off on it. When Opal Tower occurred last year, when that came out, the then state government, our state government commissioned a report, and they said that we're going to implement certain policies moving forward. But what I've been saying is okay, that's moving forward, and we're still not there yet. It's probably going to take them another 6 to 12 months before they come up with anything of substance. And by then, another 250,000 apartments are going to be completed across between New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria. Anyway, what about all the ones that have been built before? What are we going to do about that? So they've got a huge issue on their hands. And one of the recommendations were that they were going to, moving forward, they were going to inspect one in every 3, or 30% of. They were going to have spot checks. I said, so one in every. What about the other 2? Yeah, what about the other 66%? What about the other 2/3 of the equation? Yeah, what, they can go to hell. So we're in a mess. We're in a financial mess, and because the majority of the local investors got roped into putting the superannuation money, their life savings into these developments. Obviously, when we say local, the Sydney, predominantly talk about Sydney, the Sydney investors. Obviously, Sydney became too hot for them to invest in, so a lot of the financial institutions took them to Queensland and took them to Victoria because they become a cheaper alternative. You aren't able to invest in the 600,000 apartment in Parramatta. You get something of similar like in Melbourne for 400. So they took them down there. So the local investors were fragmented. A lot of them went to Perth and put all their life savings in Perth, and now Perth is an absolute bastard case right now. John Adams did a video on that last week of the homes and dwellings and everything that are up for sale, and most of them were bought by local investors, by financial institutions, corrupt financial institutions that did not disclose to their clients the huge commissions that they were getting, or the backhanders that they were getting from developers and builders. So all this is what I've been talking about for close to on about 8 to 10 years, trying to expose in different means and ways, but sometimes you just feel like you're a foreigner in a desert, and you're talking a different language, and they're not listening, and now the chickens have come home to roost.
This is just it's just chilling. Everything you've been talking about, though, it seems to me it makes a perfect analogy to its corollary in the financial world. You've talked about this influx of money that's coming from some illegitimate outside source, pumping up the valuations well beyond the unnatural levels that can't be justified by the fundamental quality. And you think about the U.S. stock market, and the economic news has been terrible for quarter after quarter after quarter now. We've had like 12,000 store closings so far this year, and it's going to, in the first 4 months, it exceeded all of last year. In the retail level, we've got poor earnings from corporations, poor forward guidance. It's like the worst employment participation rate in 40 years, and on and on and on. And yet the stock market's breaking to new highs and new highs because of this unstoppable influx of money. And then you've got the blind eye turned by the regulators, because even though there are regulations that were supposed to be on the books to kind of put some checks and balances on all this and keep it on the up and up, that the corruption making that just completely non-functional. We've had various commentators on our channel talking about the lack of enforcement on, for example, the COMEX, the Commercial Metals Exchange, and other things where just interest rate manipulations, price manipulations, and so on, just going completely unchecked. And it just and then even the analogy you talked about, this crumbling, cracks forming, just ready to collapse, and poor. When I say poor, I mean ordinary people who've invested their life savings in this thing that's ready to come down. Whereas the people who they had their way with this, got what they needed out of it. Maybe they've even moved out of that deal altogether. Are they still around? Because you talk about these Phoenix companies.
What happened was from the early 2000s, when the as I said, when the gravy train started to arrive, in the first miniature boom then, a lot of these and the deregulation of the construction industry allowed for people that were once concreters to become builders and developers, allowed for people that were trades assistants to all of a sudden become builders and developers. And what happened was also that you could do that by creating Phoenix companies, companies that were set up in order to manage a construction site or a development. And once you were sold off, then you just closed down the company and away you went. In I think it was mid 2000s or around mid 2000s, because of the huge problems that the tax office had in order to chase people for directors of companies or builders and developers that set up these Phoenix companies for the GST that they didn't pay.
Sales tax
sorry?
What's GST?
The GST, because on every sale, the developer and the builder pays a 10%. Part of that 10% of that is given to the government as a tax. So because they weren't paying that, obviously it hurt their hip pocket, so they changed the regulations to suit them, which was okay. Then they introduced directors' guarantees, so it made it a little bit harder. But nonetheless, you could keep your those statutory obligations there. You could maintain it, but you could still close down the company. You could still move on. And obviously, look, these are companies that got set up to manage these construction sites. That I call them $2 companies. That would cost you $1,200. 1,200 Australian dollars, $900 US to set up a company that you could manage a $300 million tower. So once you shut that baby down, well, chase me if you can, or catch me if you can. And you could go broke as a builder, as a developer. You could go broke or declare yourself bankrupt. In the meantime, you funneled all your assets. But look, it's very convoluted. I talk about in my videos and my discussions with Martin, I talk about the many dangerous liaisons or dangerous relationships that builders and developers have with my industry as well. Now, in my industry, you've got building managers. So once you finish the project, once you build something, then a building manager gets appointed. That's the best way to put it across without going into too much detail. A building manager gets appointed to manage the overall all the common areas of the building, because in that building you could have, let's say, it has 100 condos, you've got 100 owners. So the building manager manages all those relationships. And then you've got the property managers that manages each unit in that. So different bodies, but yet they all make up. They're all part of my industry. The marketing agent, the realtor, the selling realtor, the property manager, the building manager, that makes up my side of the industry. Now, the building managers have a very unique and very dangerous relationship with the builders and developers. in 2012, when the state government, 2011, when they started talking about changing certain policies to statutory warranties that developers and builders had, because they were basically, developers and builders were tied up to a development for approximately 6 years. Now, they diluted that to give them an out after 2 years. Even if you build on something substantive, even if you build on firm ground, a building is going to take anywhere between 4 to 6 years to settle, to its final resting place. So there's going to be there are projected, without going into the whole engineering side of things, there's going to be these things that they're going to be certain changes that are already accommodating or looked into, that are going to take place within 4 to 6 years. But again, our great parliamentarians decided to change that statutory obligation, or that statutory warranty that protected the consumer, went from 6 years to 2 years. And I for one, I went on a local radio station. I spoke to the minister back then, and I said, well, why are you allowing this? Why you obviously, for being a minister, for this industry, you obviously don't understand the industry. You don't understand how construction works. You don't understand how this whole aspect works, and there is no consumer protection. And he came back to me and said, this is on radio. Came back to me and said, well, Edwin, what we're doing is we're going to keep a 2% value of the sale of the condo. We're going to keep 2% as a bond to protect the consumer. I said, you've got to be joking. You've got to be kidding me. As the realtor, I've been offered 10% as a commission to sell the bloody unit. You think 2% is going to dampen anything, given the fact that 2% from 300 million, let's say $100 million, the other block got sold for 100 million as a gross realization. Yeah, you think 2%? What's that? What, 2 million? 2 million. For 2 million, you'd have a hard time, changing the carpets in the whole complex, let alone dealing with foundational issues, dealing with what we have now, dealing with your Opal Towers and your Muscat Towers and your Liberty Towers and all these other towers that are going to surface. That's a drop in the ocean. And that's nothing when the developers and the builders are giving me, or offering me, my industry, 10% commission to sell these badly built dog boxes to the consumers, which I refuse to, of course. Do you know what I mean? So that was the whole logic, that the 2% was going to save the whole industry. And look at where we are now. We've got, I will see, I've already said to, I call him Uppercut Adams. I've already said to Uppercut, I've already said to him, we're going to, I've already bought the picnic table and chairs. So we're going to go to Homebush. We're going to find ourselves the highest mount at the Homebush Bay, and we're going to sit there with a whole big, tub of popcorn, and we're going to watch them demolish Opal Tower. That's
you better be wearing some toxic dust masks at the time. Hey, what happens economically? Because this, again, I'm going to drive it back to that analogy of people over-investing where there's crumbling assets, this creaking house of cards, literally, but it's got this inflated price shell bubble built around it. What happens when the people who realize they don't want to be holding that asset anymore, whether it's the current owners of these condominiums or whatever, what happens when they try to sell and sell and sell? Who are the buyers that are going to pick that stuff up? And is this going to start? What's going to happen to that market?
I said I was looking at the Perth market, the one that Uppercut and Robbie Barwick went into and did an expose in Western Australia. 8 years ago, I was talking about a lot of the eastern cities, people from Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney. A lot of people that acquired wealth saw the West, saw Perth as a great alternative, as a great investment proposal. So they put a lot of the superannuation money into those developments, and back then I was saying, you're mad. You're absolutely crazy buying homes that were only worth 300,000, buying them for 600, 700 in some cases, with these so-called rental guarantees. And obviously, look, each to their own. So now we haven't got the full picture on how much money has been lost by way of people investing their life savings in it yet. Moving forward, now we've got all these people that invested in Brisbane and in Melbourne, because more so than in Sydney. There's a lot more money, local money, being put into Brisbane and into Melbourne, because they were a lot cheaper to buy. There's a lot more than in Sydney itself, but it's all going to have the same effect, because they're also on floodplains. They're also on the topography, and the development and construction is very like to Sydney. So what's going to happen with all this? Well, to give you an example, for a local, locals have lost, way more than 30-40% in WA. In these apartments, in these things that are coming up now, in these construction fiascos that are happening now, they're going to lose upwards of 40, 50, 60, 70%. The question is, would any local buy in these towers? My answer to that is probably one in 100, maybe 1 in 1,000. I think there's going to be a huge banking issue here. Because a lot of the banks have tipped a lot of money into this construction. Opal Tower is said to be valued. The gross realization of what's there is said to be worth around, say, $350 million. That's just one apartment tower. Mascot would be close to $150 million. And so there's a lot of money, and a lot of this money, obviously, because here in Australia we could there was a time where we could literally borrow 100% of the value of a property. Which was insane. So unlike a lot of Asian countries where you're buying something off the plane, you're actually paying it down as the construction progresses, to the point where your LVR, your loan to value ratio, may only be 50%. Right. But here, most of the people that bought in the last 5 to 6 years have bought with a 90% LVR, and we're talking about $1 million properties, which is 13 times our annual salary, which is insane. So we're highly leveraged. So this is just going to snowball. It's just going to get bigger. Our Reserve Bank and our government are throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at this. Soon they'll be throwing the firstborn at it as well, in order to sustain and maintain and you try to contain the fallout from what we're about to see. I really think we're going to be turning the page into a catastrophic economic disaster based on just on the construction alone. The foreign investors, I always said when they started coming over, and because I deal with a lot of foreign marketing companies. I had a lot of contacts, I had a lot of friends, acquaintances in that arena, and a lot of them would tell me that most of these investors, they didn't even care if they lost 50% of the value of the property, because at the end of the day, losing 50% of the, back then, the 500 or the $1 million that they bought over illegally didn't really worry them, as opposed to keeping it in China and losing the whole damn thing anyway.
Yeah, basically they're laundering black market money that's not officially on the books, and so anything they get out of it is to the good. So that's it's very grave, but I'm also concerned about the systemic risk, besides the direct impact on all the individuals who may have had their private investments in these things. The fact that it makes it look like, oh boy, it's a runaway market, it's really a hot market, that kind of thing. And you're saying, no, that's just a distortion, a local distortion that's being caused, permitted and allowed by graft and greed and conflicts of interest, but being caused by this focus of outside money that's completely has nothing to do with the underlying asset, the actual quality of the underlying asset. But what happens to the banking industry systemically, and the greater risk, perhaps as a snowball effect or domino effect on the greater, even not only the national economy, but potentially the world economy, if the Australian banking system takes a major hit from the literal crumbling of these assets, a collapse of these assets?
I think, look, we could be one of the triggers. I'm not an economist. I don't say I am. I'm not a financial planner. I understand certain things, but we're only a small nation in comparison to a lot of our neighbours in terms of population. We're large in terms of land mass, but there's nothing that we're really manufacturing here. There's nothing that we're doing here that would keep this economy going, other than what it has been in construction and mining. Mining's almost hit an all-time low, and construction is about to come to a standstill. And I refer, when I make these statements, it's because I back myself up with specific data. There are certain companies here and predominantly in Sydney, there are certain companies here in Sydney, New South Wales, that were building mid-tier building companies where we're building project homes, and they were building on average 700 homes a year, and now they're last year they averaged about 250, and this year, from my contacts, some of these project builders haven't even sold 30 contracts, and we're already halfway through the year. So you've got all these trade, everything just moved into and centered around construction. Everything was built around construction, and this is my whole argument of this so-called decentralization. We didn't really get decentralization of the economic and banking world of the CBD out into the suburbs. What we got is we pushed the workers further out west and gave them shopping centres and ice cream booths and coffee shops, so they can go and sit there and ponder about life. And so all these the suburbs, the outskirts, they're going to be famished, because once all this starts to collapse, I question I was talking to Uppercut the other day. I was saying, like, there are some friends, some mates, and myself. We are looking for land further out. We're looking at buying a block of land further out in really regional areas. We're already looking at that, and we're looking at transporting some containers out there and getting ready for Uppercut's Armageddon, because I think that's a lot closer than what a lot of people would like to think it is. So I don't know. I could be facetious in saying that a can of sardines is going to be worth more than $100 than some people have in their pocket very soon. Tangible material things are going to be worth a lot more than the actual physical paper. I've started to buy silver in order to silver coins in order to basically prepare, because it's I ponder, I wonder, I think about. In a way, almost alienated myself thinking about all this, because I'm forever thinking about we're about to be slapped in the face so hard that we're not going to know what's hit us economically, as a metaphor, and it's I don't know. I really it's uncharted waters for a lot of us here. I guess I have a bit of a better understanding because I make it a point, as in our previous talk before our discussion. Now we were talking about Jesse Colombo, and I'm also follow some other people on YouTube and that, and see how they're preparing, but also because I've traveled to South America. My background being South American, Latin American, and I can see how. I spent 7 years of my infancy there in South America, and I remember it vividly. So there were times where and look at the lifestyle, and I obviously understand, and being from that ethnic background and having a lot of other ethnic friends from Europe and from all parts of the world. You go to their homes, and there's always cupboards full of food, just in case. But most of the people that are living now, they're living day by day. They're just, honey, don't forget to go to the shop and pick up a couple of steaks for dinner for tonight. That sort of stuff.
Otherwise, we don't have anything to eat in the house. Yeah.
Exactly. So I don't know, mate. I don't know. I think it's going to be, it's not looking good. It's not looking good, and there's. The banking institutions, I think they're in a lot of world of trouble, and for our Reserve Bank and the government to literally throw, as I said, everything, including the kitchen sink, at all this is going. It's just we're in a lot of trouble. Short of our Prime Minister and our politicians throwing in their firstborns as well in order to try and sustain the aftermath. I don't think anything else can be done, really. I think it's just going to be, as I say, Martin and I say, Control-Alt-Delete, start again.
It's a fair warning, and it's too late for many people, but it's sobering now, again, in the present, as we see these runaway markets, stock markets, real estate markets, and so on. It's a cautionary tale ahead of us coming from the land down under. We've been speaking with Edwin, let me do that again. We've been speaking with Edwin Almeida. He is a real estate expert and a concerned advocate, really a vigilante for getting this word out, and a whistleblower about the crumbling, literally and figuratively, and corrupt state of affairs that has led to a complete misallocation of capital and a bubble market that's now showing signs of literally crumbling in Australia. Edwin, thank you for joining us this first time here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you for having me, and hope to see you soon in person.
Hey, Reluctant Preppers. If you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. And you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. If I own gold or silver, how will I ever be able to spend it?
Oh, sure. Well, consider good times or bad times. Like in good times, you can sell it back to the same place you bought it from. sdbullion.com/RP will buy it back at the best price guaranteed on the internet. You can take it to a local coin shop and get cash in your hand, completely anonymous. Some people may be willing to take gold or silver coins in exchange for goods or services. Now, in bad times, when things have really fallen apart, time after time in history, people have found that in hard times, gold and silver really does come through as something that people recognize as value even after everything else has failed.
Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP.